Piers Morgan believed he could corner Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with a smug remark, but what he didn't expect was a calm, fact-driven reply that left him without a response and the audience breaking into applause. Her chief of staff had promised the interview would be fair when he scheduled it a straightforward discussion on civil rights. He insisted Morgan wanted a strong voice and would keep the conversation respectful. But the moment Jasmine Crockett walked into the Burbank studio that Thursday morning, something felt slightly off. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just a subtle shift you only recognize after years of being in similar rooms. The young woman from makeup looked at her but stayed silent. Production staff exchanged quick glances. The assistant producer barely responded when Jasmine greeted her. It felt like a room quietly bracing for something. Piers Morgan was already in his chair when she entered the set. He didn't stand, only gave a small nod and looked back at his notes. She sat down, adjusted her microphone, and offered a polite smile. "Morning." He returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Congresswoman Crockett. Let's have a spirited conversation. We're live in 30 seconds. Jasmine shifted slightly, her posture straightening on instinct. Being underestimated was nothing new. As the daughter of a high school cafeteria worker and a truck driver, she had grown up in Shreveport, later practicing law in Dallas before entering politics. She had worked too hard to shrink now. The stage lights brightened. The producer pointed. They were live in 3.2. The music cue faded. "Welcome back to Piers Morgan Uncensored," he announced, sounding crisp and confident. "Today we're joined by Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure in the Democratic Party and someone known for strong opinions on race, justice, and American policing." She smiled calmly. "Thank you for having me." He launched into his first question. "Congresswoman, you've been very outspoken about what you call systemic racism in America. Many would say this country elected a black president twice and now has a black female vice president. Doesn't that show significant progress?" It was the familiar setup, present progress as proof the problem is solved. Then challenge anyone who says otherwise. But Jasmine stayed steady. "Progress doesn't erase what's still broken, Mr. Morgan. It simply shows we've moved far enough to keep improving." "You often use very dramatic language," he replied with a slight smirk. "You once compared certain policing practices to state-sponsored brutality. Isn't that a little emotionally driven?" The emphasis lingered. She paused a moment, then answered evenly. "When I see mothers burying sons who never reached 20, of course I feel something. That doesn't make me unreasonable. It makes me human. But I'm not here with emotion alone. I'm here with evidence." Piers wasn't seeking balance. He was looking for a clip he could use later. He leaned forward. "Do your facts ever include personal accountability?" Jasmine narrowed her eyes slightly. "Absolutely. But we should be honest. The system doesn't apply accountability equally, and we both know that." The control room grew tense. The floor director glanced between the teleprompter and the crew. The interview had barely begun, yet it was already drifting away from the expected path. Jasmine didn't raise her voice or gesture dramatically. She simply sat there, offering no exaggerated moment he could later turn into a viral meltdown. But she was only beginning. The next line Piers delivered wasn't just a nudge. It was a direct insult framed as a question. He adjusted his tie and pretended to flip through his notes, but Jasmine could tell the question wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, intentional, and aimed at provoking her. He glanced at the camera, then back at her. "Congresswoman, let's be honest. Isn't it exhausting to constantly portray America as the villain? There's a difference between fair criticism and, well, bitterness." The word landed heavily. It wasn't only aimed at her views, it targeted her character, her personality, and her right to express frustration over injustice. It was a subtle signal disguised as commentary. Jasmine leaned back slightly, not shaken, simply steady. If you think calling out injustice equals bitterness, then maybe you've gotten too comfortable watching from the sidelines. That made him stop. His jaw tightened for a moment. He didn't expect her to respond that way. "Let's be clear," she added, her voice calm and even. "You can't celebrate someone like Dr. King every January and then call people bitter in June for addressing the same issues he fought." There was a light reaction from the audience, not loud, but noticeable. Piers forced a smile. "You're clearly passionate, and I respect that. But doesn't viewing everything through a racial lens divide people further? Wouldn't it help if we moved past it?" Jasmine shook her head slowly. "That's like asking someone to stop mentioning the rain while standing in a thunderstorm." Piers gave a dry chuckle. "Clever, but let's get serious. You once criticized law enforcement after a high-profile shooting. The officer was later cleared. Yet you never adjusted your comments. Doesn't that show you reacted before the facts were known?" Her expression stayed the same, though she felt a familiar not disappointment, not fear. There it was, the setup. He wanted to frame her as someone who rushes to judgment, who makes it about race first and facts later. He wanted that headline ready to go. Crockett ignores evidence. She paused just long enough to show she was unmoved. "Tell me something, Mr. Morgan," she said quietly. "Do you think a system that clears officers 99% of the time is automatically fair? Or is it possible the system itself needs review?" He started to answer, but she continued. "Because if clearance rates equal innocence, then maybe look again at Mississippi last year. 2 unarmed teenagers shot during a routine stop. Body cameras off. Officers cleared in days. That wasn't justice. That was a cover-up. And the families are still waiting for answers. These were real cases with dates and facts, something he couldn't brush off with a grin." Piers looked momentarily unsettled. He flipped a page on his notepad, though it had nothing written on it, a delay tactic. Jasmine leaned in slightly. "You want to talk about facts, then let's talk about them. Because I show up prepared, not with slogans and not with assumptions." The studio went still. Even the makeup artist offstage froze, brush in hand, watching the monitor. But Piers pushed forward. "I just think it's harmful," he said slowly, "to keep telling young Black Americans that they're victims. Doesn't that limit them more than the system ever could?" That was when Jasmine stopped smiling. She placed her hands gently on the desk and spoke without anger. "What's harmful is telling young Black Americans to stay silent about pain. What's harmful is pretending resilience means quiet. We've been resilient. We've been strong. And we've also been ignored until we spoke loudly." The audience shifted. Someone murmured a quiet yes. Another clapped once before stopping. "But sure," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "we could tell them to move on. Pretend everything's fine. Pretend none of it happened. That would be more comfortable, wouldn't it?" Piers blinked and stayed quiet. Jasmine realized he was no longer guiding the interview, he was responding to it. But his next move would shift the entire exchange, and she sensed it before he said a word. He tilted his head, took a slow breath, and gave her a polite smile, the kind meant to soften an insult. "You say you're bringing facts, but let's be honest," he began. "Your tone, your body language, even your social media, everything comes across as emotional. You seem angry, not analytical, and people watching notice." There it was again. The word angry, not assertive, not direct, not concerned. Angry, an old tactic used whenever women, especially Black women, spoke firmly. Label them angry and dismiss them as unreasonable. Jasmine recognized it. She had seen others go through it. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. The room had already felt the weight of his comment. Someone on the studio crew winced, and a camera operator shifted awkwardly. She let the pause sit long enough to make him uneasy. Then, in a steady voice, she asked, "Do you ask Senator Burr the same thing when he raises his voice on this show and hits the desk? Do you stop the conversation to analyze his body language? Or is passion only questioned when it comes from someone like me?" Still, she didn't raise her voice. She wasn't emotional. She was simply addressing the issue directly. "I seem angry to you," she continued, "because I'm not stepping back. I don't speak with your cadence, and I don't wait for approval to express myself. But I assure you, nothing I've said today is driven by emotion. It comes from experience, and that makes it more credible than whatever article you skimmed this morning." A few people in the audience laughed, not to mock him, but because the point had landed. Piers laughed too, though his narrowed eyes gave him away. "Oh, I see. So now we're bringing up my background." "No," Jasmine replied. "You brought up mine? I'm just reminding you that I don't need your permission to speak or to challenge you. You invited me here to talk. Don't be surprised when I actually do." His smirk faded. She continued, "I've spent years in courtrooms. And Piers, you know what never qualifies as evidence? Tone, eyebrows, or social media posts. You know what does count? Facts. So let's stay with those." He opened his mouth to respond, but she moved ahead before he could. "Since you mentioned social media, let's look at yours. Last year, you tweeted that kneeling during the national anthem was attention-seeking theater. That's your right. But what were you seeking when you walked off your own show in 2021? Because someone criticized your comments about Meghan Markle." The audience gasped, not dramatically, but out of genuine surprise. They hadn't expected her to raise that point. You can call it a moment of honesty or a moment of frustration. Either way, it wasn't analytical. It was emotional. Yet somehow, you still present yourself as the only calm, reasonable voice in the room. Piers didn't move. His expression remained mostly neutral, but his posture had changed. For the first time since the segment began, he looked smaller in his seat. "You asked me if I was bitter," Jasmine said, her tone still controlled. "I'm not, but I am tired. Tired of proving I belong in every space. Tired of explaining pain. Tired of being judged by standards that shift depending on who's watching." Then she paused again. This silence carried more weight than the earlier ones. No one even breathed loudly. The audience didn't clap. They were still absorbing what she said. Piers picked up his pen and tapped it against the desk, a small nervous habit. "Well," he said, his voice tighter now, "you clearly prepared a few zingers." She didn't smile. "No, I came prepared with facts. If they sound sharp to you, maybe that reflects more on you than on me." But Jasmine knew simply quieting him wasn't enough. She needed to show him his own inconsistencies. Next, Piers gripped his pen too firmly. The camera didn't capture it, but Jasmine noticed a small sign from someone used to leading the conversation. Now realizing he wasn't, he tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, we're going off track. This isn't about me. You're here to explain your positions, not critique mine." Jasmine lifted an eyebrow, not dramatically, but enough to register. "You said earlier that my views divide people, that I'm emotional, that I promote a victim narrative. You made it personal. The moment you characterized my identity as a flaw, you shifted the direction. Now you want to step back because I answered with facts you didn't expect." He hesitated. She continued before he could respond. "You want to discuss division? Let's look at your own record." She turned to the camera. "Last year, you called protesters in Minneapolis a mob of violent agitators. Yet only 6 months later, when truck drivers in Idaho blocked roads over vaccine mandates, you called them patriotic citizens taking a stand. Same action, different language. Same issue, different skin color. A quiet reaction rose from the back of the audience. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. Piers shifted. Well, those were two different situations. Were they? Jasmine asked calmly. Both groups were protesting what they saw as unfair government action. One group was met with tear gas, the other received sympathetic coverage. One was labeled dangerous, the other praised as brave. So she asked Mr. Morgan what influenced the way he framed those situations. He began to respond, then stopped, unprepared for the length and depth of her challenge. She continued, telling him he had built a career on stirring outrage. Yet, when confronted with his own statements, it suddenly became a discussion about tone and etiquette. His expression stayed neutral, though irritation flickered in his eyes. Jasmine pressed on, reminding him that after George Floyd was killed, he posted that America needed to do better, which she agreed with. But 3 weeks later, he criticized black athletes kneeling, saying politics shouldn't enter sports. She noted he wanted the symbol, not the pushback. Black grief poetic, not disruptive. The point landed heavily. Piers looked uncomfortable, and she let the silence settle before adding that she didn't need to be liked, only heard. A small wave of clapping began. When Piers remarked that she clearly came prepared with notes, she calmly replied that she came with experience, which he called notes only because he didn't expect someone like her to be this prepared. The control room fell silent, unsure whether to cut or let the moment unfold. Jasmine turned to the camera, addressing viewers who had ever been dismissed or talked over. She presented 3 examples, drawn from court documents, sworn testimony, and public recordings. She detailed Aaron Lowe's shooting in Pasadena, Rhonda Belton's wrongful arrest in Cleveland, and Piers's own 2022 statement denying institutional racism days after a DOJ report documented disproportionate force against black drivers. When he tried to explain the context, she cut in gently, saying she had read the full transcript and that the report simply didn't fit his preferred narrative. The audience was fully engaged now. She stated she wasn't there for applause or trending moments, but represented people who buried children while television hosts debated how calm grieving families should look. A ripple moved through the audience. Facts weren't weapons, she said. Harm began when people ignored them. Piers had lost his confidence. This was no longer a sparring match, but a lesson. She softened slightly, saying he could disagree with her tone or policies, but he couldn't pretend she hadn't brought evidence or act surprised when asked to be accountable. A heavy silence filled the studio. Producers whispered about cutting to break, but the director kept the cameras rolling. Even the cameraman's hand shook slightly as he focused on her. Someone whispered that she was cooking him, but Piers wasn't amused. He looked to his producer for rescue, but Jasmine remained steady. When he claimed there was a difference between isolated examples and systemic conclusions, she replied lightly that she brought federal reports, body cam records, and judicial data, and if he saw those as isolated, maybe their standards for evidence weren't the same. A stifled snort sounded behind the camera. Then a young assistant clapped twice, unintentionally breaking the tension. Piers snapped, asking if it was a talk show or a rally now. Jasmine didn't flinch, saying it was a moment of accountability, something needed far more often. A few more light claps followed. She clarified she wasn't there to embarrass him. But when someone builds a career questioning others' credibility, I should be ready to defend their own. Piers didn't reply, not right away. He looked down, not at his notes, but at blank pages, as if trying to regain footing that was no longer there. The director finally gave a sharp signal break. Now? A producer's voice crackled through the floor team's earpieces, and the manager cut the segment before things escalated further. The screen behind them began to fade. The show was ending, but the tension still lingered, dense like the air after a summer storm. As the lights dimmed slightly for the commercial break, Jasmine remained seated, composed and focused. Piers adjusted his microphone and glanced off camera, his expression a mix of frustration and regret. But the audience wasn't paying attention to him anymore, not even slightly. Every eye was on Jasmine, not because she raised her voice or tried to provoke anything, but because she reminded everyone that truth spoken plainly and without hesitation is stronger than any performance. Yet, as meaningful as that moment in the studio was, it was nothing compared to what happened once the cameras stopped and the internet stepped in. The show had ended, but the reaction had not. Behind the scenes, producers hurried around. One was already speaking with the PR team. Another had pulled up Twitter on her tablet, shocked by how quickly the clips were spreading. In less than 3 minutes off air, Jasmine's final lines were already screen-recorded, captioned, and reposted by someone in the control room. Piers remained seated. His team approached him carefully, but he dismissed them. He never expected to be challenged, certainly not live, and not in this way. There had been no shouting, no dramatic exchange, no attempt to go viral. He had simply been surpassed by someone who stayed clear and steady. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat alone in the green room for a moment. She finally exhaled a long breath after holding herself firm under pressure. Her assistant Trina stepped in with her phone buzzing nonstop in her hand. "You're trending," she said. "Already. Top 5 in the country. Hashtag Jasminanda." She held up the screen. Jasmine gave a small laugh. "That's going to bother him." Trina nodded. "Oh, he's furious. Word is, he's asking why the segment wasn't cut sooner." But Jasmine didn't celebrate. That wasn't her intention. This wasn't about winning. It was about how many people had watched the exchange and finally felt recognized, understood, respected. "I just didn't want him rewriting the story again," she said quietly. "Not when people are still dealing with the consequences." Trina nodded. "You didn't just stand your ground. You changed something." As they talked, clips of the interviews spread across every platform. One featured Jasmine's calm reply after being called emotional. Another compared her calling out Piers's conflicting comments on different groups of protesters, one black, one white. Commentators across political lines reacted. A conservative anchor called her a lesson in staying composed. A progressive podcaster said it was the clearest example of media gaslighting being challenged in years. Even people who rarely followed politics were watching. At a bar in Tempe, Arizona, students gathered around muted screens with subtitles. In Fresno, a high school senior showed it to her mother, saying, "She sounds like you." That was the real impact, not the clapping. Not the trending hashtag, but the feeling people shared. The rare moment of watching someone speak honestly without raising their voice. Without backing down, without changing who they were to be taken seriously. Back at the studio, an audio technician approached Jasmine quietly. "Making sure no one else heard," he said. "I just wanted to thank you." She turned. "For what?" "For not making us feel like we're imagining things," he said, smiling slightly. "We've watched people avoid the point on this stage for years. Today felt different." Jasmine didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. "Thank you for saying that." He walked away, and she sat for a moment in silence. Trina returned with a grin. "They want you back next month." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Same show, same host." Jasmine tilted her head. "I'll think about it." Outside the building, a small crowd had formed. News had spread too fast for security to keep up. Some were reporters, but most were regular people, teachers, organizers, students, parents with young children just waiting quietly to see her. Jasmine stepped outside. She didn't wave dramatically. She didn't pose for cameras. She simply walked out, smiled softly, and nodded, acknowledging them without turning it into a performance. Because this was never about popularity. She had come for a conversation and left behind a reminder one people repeated in living rooms, group chats, classrooms, and buses nationwide. You can't hide the truth, just because it makes you uncomfortable. But what followed turned a viral clip into a national moment, reshaping how millions viewed her and themselves in a single evening. By early night, the clip had surpassed 12 million views. No background music, no edits, just Jasmine sitting across from Piers Morgan speaking clearly without raising her voice. A moment that didn't need dramatic effects to resonate. News anchors debated it. Radio hosts analyzed it. Comment sections surged. But something more meaningful was happening quietly. In Jackson, Mississippi, a high school debate coach paused practice to show the entire segment. "Watch your posture," he said. "That's how you manage pressure." In Fort Wayne, a grandmother shared it with her church group, saying, "This woman speaks for us." Even those who disagreed with her admitted one thing: she was composed and precise. She didn't just answer questions. She guided the conversation. By 8 p.m. Hashtags like #Jasmine owned it and #SayItPlain had filled timelines. But Jasmine posted nothing. Not a single comment. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Piers remained silent as well. No follow-up segment, no reactive blog post. His team released a generic PR statement about respecting differing opinions, but it didn't matter. People had watched what happened. No editing could rewrite it. Later that night, in her hotel room in Glendale, Jasmine sat cross-legged on the bed. Her laptop was closed. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she ignored it. She didn't want to get pulled into the noise. That wasn't why she spoke. Trina read messages aloud. "Your aunt in Baton Rouge says she had to turn her hearing aid down. Said she's never heard you this clearly." Jasmine smiled. "She says that every time." Trina looked up. "Maybe, but she's right. You were clear. And you didn't flinch." That's what people felt. It's never about volume. Jasmine nodded slowly, more to herself than to Trina.